the people.
Hello to all. Today we are honored to have with us Mr. Rick Robertson, who will speak about the Panama Canal Expansion Program. A few words about Rick. Rick received his Bachelor and Masters of Science in Civil Engineering from Oregon State University. He is a Senior Program Management Director and has worked for Jacobs for his entire career. He served for 6 years as program manager for the Panama Canal expansion program, almost 12 years in total in this program. And currently, he is the program director for the Mace Jacobs Joint Venture Program Management Consultant Team, supporting the Ellinikon Urban Development Program. He has worked on major programs in the United Arab Emirates, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Israel, USA, Panama, Egypt, and now in Greece. Programs have included diverse geographic locations, complex multi-components, emergency disaster relief, and humanitarian aid varieties. As we can understand, Rick has extensive international and US project delivery experience on major programs. Mr. Rick, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, George, and actually to the whole PMI Greece chapter community. It's a real honor to be here and share with you the program management and lessons learned from the Panama Canal Expansion Program. I am currently located in Greece. I'm working on the Ellinikon program as part of the Mace Jacobs part of the lead. And I have a lot to go through. I'll go ahead and get started. Typically, I'll share the agenda here. It's our course. I'll have a short introduction, a little bit more about myself, talk about the Panama Canal and the expansion program, the ACP, which is the Panama Canal Authority, and the management approach that they chose to develop and use this program. Talk about the expansion program details, the projects, the third set of locks, environment, society, community, and then I'll end with some of the impacts, even recognizing PMI, how they recognize the canal expansion and their operations today in Panama, and some of the lessons learned. So let me start. Typically, the way we do jobs or start presentations for Jacobs is we start with the culture of care moment. And to me, it was fitting to talk about Panama itself. And, just to reflect, Panama really is a melting pot of cultures. And the way that came is from the infrastructure developments. The first isthmus crossing between the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean was in the 1850s, and that railroad is constructed primarily from people from China, a lot of then some European and some Americans. But the original canal construction brought a lot of influx of people from across the world. First was the French attempt at the Panama Canal in the 1880s, which did not work out so well, and then the U.S. from 1904 to 1914. But people that came were from all over the globe, from parts of Asia, from Western Africa, Europe, the Caribbean, and other parts of Latin America. And it's really interesting. There's schools there, including an Italian school and even a Greek school, from the people that have traveled there early on in the original construction. You find it amazing as you see the cross-cultural people, and they're all Panamanians, which is part of their pride. This construction that was just completed, over 90% was by the Panamanians, which is really where their country pride is in that accomplishment. And they run the canal as a profitable venture, and it really stabilizes the economy. Another thing to point out, if you're into history, one of the greatest books you can read is called Path Between the Seas by David McCullough. And there's some other options there, all about the history of the original canal. I find it quite fascinating. So let me give you some highlights about my career. I am a civil engineer, worked 36 years. This was one of my first mega projects in Alexandria, Egypt. In 1989, we actually built a influent pump station in the wet, about 3 kilometers from the coastline of the Mediterranean. Gives you a little taste of how lucky I've been in different things, and I'll talk a little bit about my career. I'm from Oregon, the United States. I grew up in a small farming community in McMinnville. Went to Oregon State University and got my Bachelor's of Science and Master's of Science in Civil Engineering, specializing in geotechnical and structural engineering. I've been with one firm. It was originally C.H. Tom Hill, which we got bought out in 2017 by Jacobs for all my 36 years. Again, feeling really fortunate, great company. As you can see on the left-hand side, I've done a number of different roles, starting in the field behind a drill rig as a geotechnical engineer, evolving in design, construction, claims, contracts, project manager, and then now latter part of my career has been a program manager in different areas. Again, I've been very fortunate to do all types of work, roads and bridges, wastewater treatment plants, water conveyance treatment plants, a lot of marine works, ports and harbors, environmental work, cleanup, and then urban development, which I'm doing now, and even some entertainment facilities. Going from left to right here, actually, these are some of the works I did in Sri Lanka after the tsunami in 2004, working on some fish harbors and water supply, and then a picture working in Cairo in the 1990s, and then the Sheikh Zayed Desert Learning Center. This is the construction on the far right in Al Ain, UAE. So my career really has been around major projects and programs. Starting in Southern California when I first got out of school, doing cleanup environmental for the Superfund program, and then working in Egypt for 6 years on 2 big programs themselves. Also having the opportunity to work in Israel, and I'll pause here and pray for peace in that region. 2 years in there was a fascinating experience for me. Working in Texas on Chevron's largest oil refinery liability in the world at that time. Then going over in Sri Lanka after the tsunami in 2004, working in UAE, Panama for 12 years on the program I'll be talking about today, and now a year here in Athens, Greece. So 36 years, 26 of them have been outside the U.S. Really fortunate with my company and the opportunities, but the biggest reason is having family support. In the center there, you can see my 2 daughters and my wife. They've been able to follow me around, which has been part of the reason I've been successful, along with support back in Oregon. But really, for me, the big programs, I've pursued things and felt really good about meaningful results. Doing humanitarian emergency aid has been really helpful over the year about thinking about my impacts, making the world healthier with healthier environments, and looking for programs that have countrywide and global impacts, and many of those on the left-hand side. When I reflect on this, it's really about, as I think about the successes, a lot of it for me over the years, I've developed thinking about strategic leadership, looking long vision, how I can bring things to program, look out beyond our day-to-day things, look out 3 months, 6 months, a year ahead. These programs need that kind of focus at times. Making sure risks are followed throughout the life cycle of delivery through the planning, execution, and operations, and having a collaborative, integrated teamwork, which I'll demonstrate through the Panama job, is so essential, along with open communications. But there's one thing that I leave all of you to think about. No matter what project or what you're working on, it's always about the people. If you have good people that work with you, you empower them and trust them, it makes it really easy and a successful way. So now let me get on to the Panama Canal. This is a picture of the old locks in Miraflores, 2 lanes here, and I'll talk a little bit about Panama itself. So the Republic of Panama is about 75,000 square kilometers, which is about 55% of the land area in Greece. Has about 4 million people. Very similar. It's most of the people, or over half of the people, live in one city, and that's Panama City. And you can look here in the inset map. It shows Panama. It's interesting because the north is where the Atlantic Ocean or the Caribbean Sea is, and then the south is the Pacific Ocean. The larger inset here is the Panama Canal, which extends about 80 kilometers from the Atlantic Caribbean side to the Pacific through that red alignment. The operations, again, it started in 1914 and went successfully through 1999 with the U.S. government. In 1979, the Panamanians negotiated a treaty with the U.S. to have a 20-year transition period, which now in 1999, it was turned over to the Panama Canal Authority, ACP. They've been the manager since. They have over 8,700 employees. It's one of the largest employers in Panama. And here's another interesting fact. The Canal Authority is a for-profit government agency. And I'll talk about that more. Their profits go back to the Panamanian government. There is a firewall between them and the Canal Authority and the rest of the government, so it allows to prevent any corruption or anything like that, but they run a very efficient work. So what's so important about the canal that you need to understand is, first of all, it's all about water. And here is a cross section of the Panama Canal. It's fed from Lake Gatun, which is really fed from Mother Nature. They get about 2.5 to 3 meters of rainfall a year. The major tributary is the Chagres River that comes in to the Lake Gatun. And then it's about 27 meters above sea level. About 5.2 billion cubic meters of water are in Lake Gatun. But as you look at the canal, it's really a water staircase as you look at it. On the Atlantic side, it has 3 succession locks, each about 9-meter steps, called the Gatun locks. These are old locks, and it takes about 8 to 10 hours to transit through from this side, the Gatun locks, all the way through to the landing of the end of Pedro Miguel and Miraflores locks. On the Pacific side, it's actually separated. The first step is the Pedro Miguel locks. There's an intermediate lake called Miraflores Lakes, and then the final 2 steps are the Miraflores locks. That's the old canal that's still used, quite prevalent, but it's important to understand that each transit takes about 200,000 cubic meters of water. So, and everything is gravity. There's no pumping or of water. It's all through hydraulics of gravity flow, which is, again, part of the fascination. Of all the water, about 59% is used for the transit lockages. And right now, the Lake Gatun also has other stakeholders, including for the population, for drinking water, for power generation. And one of the other big effects on Lake Gatun, because it is a hot place in Panama, is evaporation. So now let me move on to the canal expansion itself. So Panama, if you think from a maritime perspective, it has and it connects 180 different trade routes, touches nearly 2,000 ports in 170 countries. It's about 3% of all global maritime trade go through the Panama Canal. You can see some of the trade routes here that are heavily shown in colors. But in 2006, the Panama Canal Authority formalized the expansion program. And it actually had started the planning, pre-planning, it was in the 1990s, but they really now got to the point where they said, hey, what's our objectives? They wanted to grow the canal and the profitability, again, to the contributions to the national treasury of Panama. They also had to compete with the canal competitiveness, also the Suez Canal over here, and then the U.S. intermodal system, which is primarily the trucking and railroads that were moving goods and services from the west to the east coast, or vice versa. But the most effective way to do this was to allow larger ships, what they're called Neo-Panamax-sized ships, to go through the canal itself. So to give you an idea, this is the existing locks is in the upper part of this, and a ship goes through the existing locks. It's about the locks are about 320 meters long, 33 meters in width, with a draft of 12.6 meters. A typical Panamax ship, which is what they're called, that goes through the old locks, has about 4,400 TEUs, which is basically 20-foot containers, if you can think of that. And that's what the old locks were with the 2 lanes. The new locks, the new expansion, it was about 366 meters long, 51 meters in width, and a draft of 15.2 meters. So the big difference right here, now you're up to 13,000 to 14,000 TEUs, or 20-foot containers, almost 2.5 times the volume that could transit through the locks. Again, part of that was the reason. Typically, on a day, they transit about 35 to 40 ships. They use all 3 lanes, the new locks and the 2 existing, and about 13 to 14,000 vessels a year. So now let me talk a little bit about the expansion program itself. Again, it was the Canal Authority was the owner. The referendum approved by the public of Panama, the people, in 2006. We were the program managers and started in 2007, which again is an important aspect. We started very early on in the program. The program itself was a $5.25 billion budget. And to this day, that is the same budget. It's really quite remarkable how we were able to accomplish that, and with the Canal Authority working so closely with us. There's 9 major construction projects. They were typical design, bid, build, and a design build over basically 9 years of construction, and I'll talk about that more. There was over 41,000 people that worked on the job. Some of the big numbers on the work, dredging and excavation for the whole job was over 150 million cubic meters. The concrete was over nearly 5 million cubic meters of concrete for all the locks. And the steel rolling gates, there's 16 of them, 8 on each side on the Pacific and 8 on the Atlantic. They range between 3,000 and 4,000 metric tons. I'll talk about those later. I did want to point out the largest single project was the third set of locks, which was over $3 billion in one contract. Here is the Pacific site. On the upper side, you can see the existing old canal and the 2 steps here on Miraflores locks, Miraflores Lake and Pedro Miguel in the far distance, and the new Cocoli locks, which are almost near completion. You can see here the difference is the 3 locks are all together. You have the lower, middle, and upper chamber, and then you also have these water-saving basins, which allowed 60% of the water to be recycled every time a lockage goes through. And I'll talk more about that later. Okay, this is an interesting photo here separating. This is actually the new locks prior to flooding, 9-meter steps here in each one. Again, quite an impressive and interesting job. So the Canal Authority, what they, you think about, they're running and operating the canal for a number of years. And so they're experienced in engineering and doing different works and construction, but they were not experienced in doing a large program. And that's why they looked at a program management to take on the benefits and get the right advice for logistical and the technical complexity of this program, putting together interrelated multiple contracts, and then understanding that this was going to be a multi-billion-dollar budget execution. So when you think about what the canal was looking at and what we brought to the table is, multiple projects. You have Project A, Project B, and Project C, and you have your management and your resources and your risks. Well, the programmatic approach was to say, okay, let's put all those 3 projects or 4 projects, or in this case, 9 projects, under a common governance and strategy. Then also bring in the right functional areas, again, supporting all the projects and come up with a focused project delivery approach, providing the program vision all around to what we call a program approach and an integrated project delivery, rather than a discrete individual project delivery. Overall, this gives you the desired benefits, and that's what we brought to the table with a program management approach. So when you think about program management, and what we also thought is bringing, again, best practices. Our company had been doing large programs for a number of years. It was bringing in the tools and controls, the management model, governance, the delivery model, the type of delivery model systems you could do, the execution of contract and procurement, and most important, again, I emphasize this, is the people and the right leadership to drive the results. The Canal Authority, when they started, they really said, here's our priorities. We want really to get the initiation, the guidelines and tools set up so they could have the appropriate governance and guidance. Then they really said, we need program control management. We got to get that focused early on. And that was to focus on the early projects of some of the dredging and earthworks, and then the overall management of the locks projects. On the bottom here are some of the locks construction project photos. And by the way, all these photos are from the canal expansion themselves at different times. These are some of the lock chambers. I'll talk about those more, and some of the different units that were put together, and then some of the dredging activities. So who are the stakeholders? Well, first of all, again, because it's the government entity, it was for the people of Panama, the benefits of the profitability. Then came the Canal Authority themselves, the board of directors for the canal, and then of course the benefits to the global maritime industry. This photo on the right-hand side is of the Atlantic site. You have the Gatun locks here, where all 3 locks are together from 1914 and 2 lanes. This is Lake Gatun in the background, and then the new Agua Clara locks, again, also with the water-saving basins. And the bottom part of the photo is where it connects into the Caribbean Sea or the Atlantic Ocean. So when you think about program management delivery, there's a lot of options that a client can take. With the increasing client responsibility on the vertical axis and then the increasing consultant responsibility on the horizontal axis. Well, the way the Canal Authority looked at it, the Panama Canal Authority, they wanted an integrated program management team. They wanted people to come in, help them, teach them, but they still wanted the decision-making process. So that's really how we went about the approach. So the Canal Authority maintained that complete control of the program. They were the decision makers in all aspects. They also, the Canal Authority was, because they had an operating transit and they did not want to disrupt, and we did not disrupt any of the transit operations throughout the 9 years of construction, they had a separate division with a separate vice presidency for the expansion program. They also wanted their own people to learn how the skills for doing these large complex programs without minimal outside consultation. Well, our team was there for 15 years, but it wasn't a huge team. We ranged between about 40 people and down to 6 or 7 at the very end. What we did is we had to conform to their organization. We had to become an integrated team, part of their program, become advisors on the program and construction. We had to train and mentor. We had to bring in our best practices, which we did. We were in mirrored roles in several of these, and I'll talk about that later. And we brought in technology transfer. We also were driving the implementation of the program, project discipline, organization, setting up the process and procedures, helping them to pay attention to risk, not just running a risk register, but really identifying risks that had mitigations to impact the longevity of the program. And then, like in any construction contract, being able to assist them on claims and any disputes. So part of this, and this is a cool photo, look at the construction here, the amount of cranes, tower cranes, mobile cranes. Again, it was a massive job, a lot of logistics. But from a program perspective, what we were looking at was a one team, one mission approach. This goes back to the historic slogan that the Canal Authority had with the U.S. government when they transitioned from 20 years, from 1979 to 1999, was to establish the same spirit of cooperation with no egos, no arrogance. It was really to have the same objective, and that's what we also embraced with them. Part of it, like I mentioned, we started early in 2007, and then for our team members, you had to have a minimum of 20 years experience, had to have worked on a mega-sized program or project, which mainly meant over $1 billion project. And then what we did is we were integrated across all of the different areas of the program, horizontally and vertically. What I mean is program management, construction management, risk, quality assurance, project controls, document controls, contract, procurement, contingency, design, and other specialized support areas, really to help them understand and put together a full organizational capacity. Look at the focus on risk, as I mentioned. We were really in a partnered approach. This is one of the team of partnering charterings early on where we did some work for the indigenous tribes together. And then ultimately what we're looking at is mentorship. This is the construction on the Atlantic site. Quite interesting. You can see some of the deep excavations that were going on along with the tower cranes getting in place. And then again, mega-sized excavation works that was going on in parallel. Another part of the program was setting up the program management digital tools. We set up the program management information system. Again, this was back in 2007 when a lot of these things were less sophisticated than what you can find on the market right now. We set up the dashboards, leveraging SharePoint. We use P6, which of course is common for scheduling now. And then we used Primavera Contract Manager. That was kind of our document control tool with all the contractors working together with the client. And then we also set up a photo video managing system where we registered and had over 400,000 photos, I think, at the end. And this, again, was before a lot of the cell phone photos that you could do. But it's been a great tool for going back to the history. Looking again at the program, some of the successes was around the collaboration and communication. It's such a key thing to recognize and how you do it. And it's not only just in certain areas, it's across the whole organization. And when you think about it, the organization was not only the Canal Authority themselves, but their existing transit operations, the people, the board, the banks, the lending institutions, and the locations themselves. Remember, the Atlantic and Pacific sites were 80 kilometers apart. Some of the communications included these, we had quarterly and monthly magazines or distributions that went out to the Canal Authority people. There's signage. We had a 24/7 webcam on both the Atlantic site and the Pacific site during the construction. So anyone could go online and see the level of construction. And then the other really cool thing, again, was about the Panamanian people. It was bringing them to the end. So in 2015, prior to flooding, we opened up the Pacific locks and had over 10,000 visitors come in to the canal and see the locks themselves, come up close. And again, it was about participating and being with the Panamanian people. One of the really interesting things about the challenges you have, and this is this little yellow book here, it's a legacy thing from C.H. Tom Hill days, was the complexity of teams. And that was Jim Howland in that little yellow book. And he wrote, no matter what the organizational structure, if the people want it to work, it will. And you can see this was just the program on the design build locks. The yellow areas were people from our company, and all the rest of the colors were different people from the Canal Authority. It was complex in a lot of ways, but a lot of partnership in different areas. And this is just the program. We had, as I mentioned, over 41,000 people that worked on the construction and different aspects of the work. And proudly to say, the Panamanians, again, had over 37,000, which was more than 90% of the people were Panamanian. But it wasn't just them. The Canal Authority is smart. They understood. They had to reach back, and we used people that came from different areas of specialization from 80 different countries to successfully do this work. Again, communication was the key. I mentioned our partnership and mirror management, and this gives you a demonstrate of what that meant. So as you can look in some of these roles, there's shared roles between like the QA manager and the project controls manager and then the Pacific and Atlantic locks. So sometimes with Jacob's people on top and then the Canal Authority. In 2010, that's what it looked like, these blue lines. Then in 2013, and part of our mentorship and really trying to work ourselves out of a job, a lot of these roles went to the Canal Authority themselves. We taught them, they had confidence, they knew how to do things. We reversed roles in some case where the Canal Authority person was on top. That was part of what we were doing in reality, was to bring best practices and essentially work ourselves out of a job where we could, and it was very valuable to the Canal Authority. So I talk about one team and one mission. It doesn't mean that everything was smooth. There was a lot of challenges. The program dynamics, you had people that came in, as you can imagine. We had people with 20 years experience, and all of a sudden they're advisor and they had to do heavy lifting. That was part of our adjustment as an organization, and it was understanding that we had clear and precise communications also with the contractor and about what their roles and responsibilities were. These kind of things challenged us, but we were the partnership and the leadership really helped us to overcome them. There was a lot of cultural differences. The major contractor was people from Spain and Italy and Belgium. The Atlantic site, they actually preferred to use Spanish, where the Pacific site was Italian. And like I said, having 80 different nationalities oftentimes had its complexities. But again, through successful communication and partnership, we're able to overcome a lot of it. So now let me get on to the projects of the canal itself. So again, looking at a plan view, this is the route for the Panama Canal and the icons of the big projects. So both ends on the Atlantic and the Pacific, major projects were for the deepening and widening of the entrance channels. Again, to allow the Neo-Panamax ships. Within Lake Gatun itself, there's also a number of individual dredging projects. A lot of them were self-performed by the Canal Authority or the local contractors. There was also the raising of Lake Gatun to allow more water in the lake. And then the major projects were around the Pacific locks themselves and the Atlantic locks. And I'll go through those in more details along with this one here in the Pacific. As I mentioned early on, and this is an important aspect on any delivery job, is security of financing. And the Canal Authority, with that $5.25 billion budget, they went out to multilateral banks, bilateral banks, and here's a list of them and the amount of money that they went on loan. But the Canal Authority is pretty shrewd and smart in the economics, because they run a transit business. They negotiated some really strong deals for them, very favorable, including a 20-year repayment period with a 10-year grace period. So the success of the canal has allowed them to really bring the money back to them from a cash flow standpoint and make this quite successful. Now I'll talk about some of the major projects. So this is the Pacific Access Channel. And if you remember, I told you this is an aerial view with the Pacific Ocean's to the left, Lake Gatun is to the right coming in. On the lower part is the existing locks, which you had the Miraflores locks, 2 steps here, and to the right of that is the Pedro Miguel locks. And because those were separated, it's quite a distance and a challenge. What we decided to do for the new locks is, again, to put all 3 together. But the reason that was successful is we had to put a dam in between the Miraflores Lake and Lake Gatun here. And I'll show you that in a minute. So there's a series of projects, Pack 1, Pack 2, Pack 3, Pack 4, where they did all the excavation. This is a cross section of it. You can see the big hill that was taken out. The last contract was over 267 million, and it was about 50 million cubic meters of excavation and dredging just for this one single project, or one area of the project. As I mentioned, the dams were part of the big deal here. The earth dams that were constructed, there was over 5 kilometers of earth dams. They're called the Brinken dams. A cross section here shows you this is Lake Gatun level water, which is 9 meters above the Miraflores Lake water. So you can see that in the cross section. These were natural rock fill from the local basalt materials with also locally natural available clay core. Very interesting construction. Again, it was very vital for the execution of the work. The other project I mentioned was the raising of the Gatun Lake level, which they did by approximately 45 centimeters. And this is the old spillway dam from 1914. And what we had to do is modify the spillway gates, fabricate some new ones. Essentially what it did by raising these 45 centimeters, increased the volume of the lake by 191 million cubic meters. What that really represents is about 800 to 850 transits a year, or an increase of 6% of new transits to go through the Panama Canal. So it's a significant impact to them. Now I'll talk about, again, the biggest project, the third set of locks. This is during the construction on the Pacific site. This is from the Lake Gatun site, which this is the inlet structure. These little areas is where the lake water would come in. And then you can start to see the lock chamber walls. This is the upper chamber and where the first set of gates were going. So what was really important in our program management approach was to bring in our best practices about risk. And from a risk on construction, it was about how do you balance the risk, the allocation and mitigation measures. So first of all, we looked at bringing in a contract RFP, which was a common type of international contract. We used a FIDIC contract. Those of you in the construction industry or engineering industry may recognize it, and it was widely accepted. We did an extenuous bidder pre-qualification process. We invested a lot of time during the procurement on the terms and conditions and making sure we had the technical requirements right. We really didn't want scope creep or changes during the execution of the work. The other thing that we did for all the bidders is we put in an escalation clause for 5 of the key elements. We knew things were going to change over time, the cost for cement, structural steel, reinforcing steel, fuel, and labor. And we wanted those to not be to allow contractors jack up their price. So we provided a provision that was fair for all the contractors to make sure that they didn't have any loss as escalation of these things happen. Finally, when we were doing the overall tender process, we had a number of changes and amendments. We worked with each of the individual bidders towards a win-win, and we made changes. So again, that risk balance was felt. Overall, we ended up with 3 qualified tenders. Our program management team, like I said, was really execution about thinking about risk, having open dialogue with the Canal Authority, making sure that they knew what was going on with the tenders, running a very tight tendering process, and making the appropriate adjustments. The results ended up with the single largest contract being awarded to a consortium of contractors. Saussure out of Spain, and Cellini and Padero now out of Italy. They're called WeBuild for those in the civil engineering market. And then also a smaller percentage went to John DeNewell, and then a local Panamanian contractor called CUSA. Again, because this was design build, they had their partners from Montgomery Watson Harza, which is now Stantec, Tetra Tech, and Shimilai, who did the gates out of Trisi, Italy. Then Hyundai did the gates out of South Korea. Designers were all over the world. Some of the major numbers here you can look at, we had on this job itself 46 million cubic meters of dredging and excavation, about 22 million cubic meters of backfill behind the lock system. We crushed our own aggregate. The Pacific side had a basalt source, so they actually crushed over 9 million tons of aggregate and sand for the concrete, nearly 200,000 tons of reinforcing steel, and again, as I mentioned, 4.75 million cubic meters of concrete. This is some of the photographs, and I'll talk some more about it, of the lock systems, the lock heads, the chambers themselves. And again, really interesting, complex sites where logistics was vital. Because it was design build, it wasn't all about construction. The design considerations, they actually put together a filling and emptying model of the overall lock system. This is a plan view of one of the locks on either you could say the Pacific or the Atlantic, where you had the lake entrance, which is the upper chamber, the middle chamber, and the lower chamber, and then the adjacent water saving basins where the water would recycle during each transit. You can see some of the hydraulics studies that were done. These are some of the structures that went underneath the lock chambers because you had water connection on both sides on the chambers, and how the hydraulic flows were looked at in different patterns. Finite element analysis, seismic zone is a big deal in Panama, just like it is in Greece. So they had to design for that for the structures. And then this is a little 3D view of the rolling gates themselves and the connection of the cable system. These are 5-centimeter diameter cables, and each one of them was over 1 kilometer long to run these gates. Again, 16 gates. Not only that, on the permanent works, there was lots of temporary structures, earth dams, disposal areas that all had to be designed. So I want to take a second and show you what it looks like in a cross section of the chamber itself and the water connections with the water saving basin. So during a lockage, the water then itself, as you went down step by step and the valves are open, would then go back into the different partitions of the water saving basins until the ship was at the same level as the next lock, and then it would transit through, and then the water was able to be replenished without the new water by 60%. Ultimately, what you ended up with was about 7% less water, even though these are wider, longer, and deeper than the existing locks. Overall, 60% of the water is shared with this new system, and again, all gravity. There's no pumping within the system, all from a gravity perspective. So this is I'll take you through 7 years real quick of one of the construction sites. This was the Pacific site. The lower part of the photo is actually Pacific Ocean at low tide. So this was just mud flows that came in from the tide. This was the canal expansion actually started, you can imagine this, prior to World War II, and this was stopped in 1942. So it was a good location to where they were looking to do the construction, but it was a little bit different. In 2010, there was a lot of the early wildlife rescue and clear and grub. I'll talk about the wildlife rescue later. But you can see some of the old path. Again, the basalt, we're stripped down to seeing the basalt formation. Then you can see the outline in 2011 of the excavation. A lot of drilling and blasting for this basalt. First tower cranes going in. Then you can see the industrial plant on the left side being done for the concrete batch plants. Then in 2012, concrete was really starting to go. You can see the outline of the chamber walls and some of the big conduits where the water would run vertically as well as would go into the chambers. And then backfilling where it would become the water saving basins. You can see this was formerly a hill, again, of basalt deposit that we used for the concrete aggregate and sand. 2013, concrete really is rolling now. Again, you can see the batch plant. Here's a tent that went over the sand because it rained so much in Panama. I was trying to keep a steady moisture content on the sand as it went into the batch plant. 2014, now you can really start to see the chamber walls are in place. The lockheads here, this is a lockhead closer to the Pacific Ocean, the outlet structure here. Then the next lockhead, you can see one of the gates that's been in place, and I'll talk about those later. Some temporary ramps that were done for each step. A lot of temporary construction that was done, again, for the execution of this work. 2015, they started flooding, and then we had a hiccup. There actually was a design consideration that wasn't made, so we got delayed 5 months as we went back, emptied this area, and made some fixes along each step of the locks, and then successfully got into 2016, and we completed the project. I'll show that some more later. I did want to talk a little bit more about the concrete itself, which was a major part of the job. These lockhead structures, which house the gates, were about 160,000 cubic meters each, and there was 4 of the lockheads on each of the sites. They used different types of concrete methods. Here's a pump truck. We use conveyor systems. The design life for these concrete structures was 100 years, and very extensively looked at. Some of the models that were done were on the lock chamber walls, and here you can see some of the chambers. They are done as we called monoliths. So one of the chambers itself would have 23 monoliths on each side and another 23 for 46 monoliths. These chambers right here, the conduits where the water would flow parallel to the chambers, were big enough for 2 buses to drive through. That's how big they were. Concrete pours were extensive, large. You can see also some of the slots here were the gates. The mechanical systems, again, was a massive part of the job, being able to control the water and to reuse it. Inside, here's some of the chambers themselves. With any concrete work, there's some repair because these were hydraulic surfaces. It took 300 people over 2 years to finish up all the lock chamber walls inside. A lot of repair work that was done. Then you can see in the lower left, the chamber walls itself. These are about 30 some meters tall, and some of the construction work that was going on. Concrete production, as I mentioned, was a significant part of the logistics. So a lot of haul roads being able to access inside and out at all portions of the job. During the peak, we nearly were able to hit 100,000 cubic meters a month. What does that really mean? We're around 4,000 to 5,000 cubic meters a day, or approximately 500 truckloads a day. Now, the concrete batch plant, you can kind of see here, there was 2 batch plants, each one on the Atlantic and Pacific site. Those were the largest construction batch plants in the world at the time. They could do nearly 500 cubic meters of concrete an hour. They never reached that, but that was the vision. Again, a lot of complexity and planning done well in advance to be able to execute the work. Not only concrete, again, the mechanical system, the lock valves, there was 152 valves on each of the sites. And you can see some of the dimensions here, how big they were, but they ranged between 18 to 6 tons each. So again, a lot of coordination. These were done and produced in South Korea and shipped over to Panama. Like I mentioned, one of the massive big complexities, again, this is the plan view, was the steel rolling gates themselves. Again, each site had 8 gates, and this is redundancy. So actually, you could put one of these gates into this chamber, lock it off, and still maintain and allow the Panama Canal to operate. That was part of the system, was to make sure there was redundancy in every step. Since there's only 1 lane in the new locks, or the old locks, you have 2 lanes, they can put one out of service. In this case, they had to use different strategies. So the gates themselves were about 58 meters in length. They ranged in height between 22 and 33 meters in height, depending on what the ocean level was. On the Pacific was the highest one. And their thickness was about 8 to 10 meters. As I mentioned, they were fabricated in Italy, and they were shipped over 4x4 in these ships, these transit ships. A lot of again, temporary structural work, even to put them together to ship them over. And then they were docked in the the Atlantic site. There was a temporary docking system. This concrete pad that was put together was all pile supported. This was the parking lot for the gates. And then since all the gates came on the Atlantic side, then one by one, those that went to the Pacific side, the 8 gates, took a separate barge over, and this was the Pacific, where they actually came offloaded a temporary ramp down into the chambers. They were moved by SPMTs, self-propelled modular transport hydraulic units. You can see some of these here. They're similar to how they move rocket ships. And then each one was inserted. There was concrete, smooth paving all the way to put them in. And I can say proudly the contractor did 15 out of 16 without chipping the corner. And only one case did they have a small accident, which was easily to repair. The other part of the installation was once they were installed was then hooking up the mechanical systems. Like I said, this cable is over 5 centimeters in diameter and about 1 kilometer long. They were temporarily raised up from these lift systems, and then underneath all the temporary concrete work was chipped out, and they run on rails right now. The other feature, which I think I mentioned, but maybe not, that the lock gates themselves had a buoyancy chamber. So once they're flooded, 90% of the weight then was reduced from the buoyancy. So they're able, the pulley systems again engineered so that they could go back and forth with that design criteria. Then the other part of the aspects, of course, was the building support. So each site itself had over 46 buildings per complex, machinery buildings, control buildings, and cross-unders. That was an important aspect. If you can imagine, this cuts the country in half. So the cross-unders are where all the utilities, potable water, telephone, electricity, fiber optics go underneath the locks. All those were coordinated in deep excavations as part of the work. Here's some of the finished buildings right now in the Pacific site. One of the major buildings also was the control tower. There was a control tower on each site. They're about 15 meters tall, 52 meters tall, about 15 stories. And in this is really the control center where they can look at all the locks themselves, all the chambers. They can look at all the areas. There's big monitors that show the whole canal along the whole transit, even in the Lake Gatun aspects. The other unique thing that I want to point out is we've talked a lot about the massive amounts of earthwork and concrete and steel, but this was equally as big as on the electrical systems and control systems. There was over 2,000 kilometers of electrical cables, 400 kilometers of fiber optic cables that were installed just to help to manage and run and operate the system. And when you think about those themselves, the same complexities of thinking about design and installation, supply chain, and bringing them all together. And then, of course, the startup and commissioning was a complex level system itself. So where did we get to? Here it was on June 26, 2016, was the inauguration and grand opening of the Panama Canal. 2 days before the inauguration was the taking over certificate from the contractor to the Canal Authority. And again, I talk about the Canal Authority pride. They stripped all branding, all contractor, vendors, anyone else. The only thing that you saw in the inauguration was the Panamanian flag, because they knew they're the ones that built it, and they were very proud of it. There was a lottery for their first container ship to go through. I was somewhere in one of these small people over here. Happy to be there during the inauguration. It was an amazing event to be able to live through. I did want to, again, talk about other things that happened besides the main work, the environment, the social and community aspects. The Canal Authority is very proud of what they walk the talk about commitment to environmental and social aspects. Some of the hugely important things was the wildlife rescue plan. They rescued over 5,000 animals, sloths, crocodiles, snakes, different animals. This croc was well over 4 meters long that they relocated. They also paid attention to the archaeological aspects. This was actually a bucket from the original canal construction. Some things from the European conquistadors that came over. A lot of pride in what they did. They had over 1,000 hectares of reforestation in 15 different locations across the country. They took a lot of pride in what they did. The other aspect of big programs is what you do outside of work. And we are lucky to partner up with the Canal Authority and a lot of our people. We established the first Engineers Without Border in Panama. We had over 10 years of projects, 220 projects that were done, Some of the major things included some of these large suspension footbridges. We partnered with Bridges to Prosperity and Peace Corps, enabling hundreds of people to get access that wouldn't because of the high river water during rain events. Different types of projects here listed between rainwater collection and solid waste management, things like that. Again, part of the effects on big programs in countries. So the impact, again, a nice photo here of the Atlantic site, Agua Clara locks and the Gatun locks from previously. As I mentioned early on, it was great to see PMI recognize the Panama Expansion Program as one of the top 50 most influential projects in the last 50 years. In 2019, it was listed number 2 on those in the infrastructure category, and it was ranked 27 overall. Number 1 was the World Wide Web, so I'm sure it was tough to compete with them. Number 2 was Apollo 11. And number 3 was the Intel microprocessor chip. But I think, all of us that worked on this job feel really proud that PMI recognized us as high as they did. Fantastic program to be part of. So operations today, as I mentioned, the Canal Authority in 2022 contributed almost $2.5 billion profit back to the National Treasury. Prior to this, they were getting close to $1 billion. So that shows you not only was the cargo and tonnage about 2.5 times, the profitability has been 2.5 times back to the government and to the Panamanian people. In fiscal year 2022, they had a record tonnage of nearly 520 million tons. They had over 14,000 transits. The new locks, they're averaging over 11 transits a day and had over 18,000 through the new locks since 2022. And 55% of their revenue comes from the new locks. The main users here, you can see the different countries, but the other interesting thing was once not only was there longer ships and deeper ships, but it was also wider, allowed for the LPG and the LNG, the gas carrier market to expand, and that ended up being quite lucrative for the Canal Authority. Some people ask this question, what's the transit fees? Well, now with the container ship, the size, it's $1 million per toll for a transit for a full-size Neo-Panamax. And last year they set a record with one of the container ships with over 16,200 20-foot containers. So the big outcome for the Republic of Panama, really financial stability for decades. The old locks provided decades of it. Now this is going to help them for years and years. It also strengthened the global world trade supply chain as an alternative to other competing things, and allowed the Canal Authority to have strategic growth for employment, where they needed to look for business expansion. And one of the big things that they have in the next decade is how to increase and maintain the water. Global warming is not a friend to them at times. They don't get as much rain, so they have to look for alternative water sources. So finally, mega project lessons. There's a paper here that is a lot of this work was based off from a PIAC conference in 2018. I was one of the authors on it, but it comes down to people, processes, and tools, and people first. That's the order. Again, bringing in a program management team early on is so critical to help you to establish the guidelines, the governance, and be able to execute. Team integration. I can't say enough of how important we were in the success of working side by side with the Panamanians, having that good communication. During the bidding process, being transparent. Now, they are a government authority, but I think it goes for anything private. Having that bidding and evaluation and contract award helps you not only during transparency of the award process, but later on, if there's any disputes or challenges, that really is helpful. Having clear and precise contractor agreements. Again, we worked really hard on making sure the contractor agreements were in good place, talking about what everyone's roles and responsibilities were. Risk management for the full life cycle, as I mentioned, contracting, delivery, and also for your reputation. The Canal Authority, again, is highly looked at as a reputable group. Their clients are the global maritime industry. They brought in trusted advisors to help them, and we did with the how to manage change and complexity and unpredictability. The other thing in any of these, on these big jobs, mega jobs, is understand you can have a diversity of cultures and languages and expect that and be able to handle that and know that people will have different viewpoints on how they want to execute the work. Also, that was important for the Canal Authority was bringing a claims management team early on and help to manage the construction projects. And of course, bringing in the right technical expertise and the engineering best practices and solutions have been really vital for it. So I'm going to have now, this is a short 2-minute video, and it'll show you 5 years of construction in a small time lapse video. So 5 years earlier, this is the Pacific site. Some of the excavations that are going. This is near the Pedro Miguel locks. Now they're excavating in the Pacific Chamber, some of the basalt formation. This is Lockhead 2. Some of the tower cranes, some of the excavation, some of the formwork, setting up the different support systems, again, maintaining logistics support. You can see how busy the site was, moving rapidly. Then you can start to see here Lockhead 2, some of the formwork, some of the concrete starting, some of the progression all the way down the full length of the lock chambers themselves, and then the concrete batch plant, which I mentioned earlier. This is the Atlantic site, a different formation. It was a soft siltstone type of rock. They had to use shotcrete on the walls. Again, putting together concrete. You can see the tower grains moving around there on rails, again, for flexibility to allow because of the length of the project. You can now see some of the concrete monoliths going in place for the lock chambers, which I talked about. And then now you can see from a bigger viewpoint, again, the chamber walls and the lock heads coming in place, progressing. Now the backfill and the massive amount of utilities, electrical systems, fiber optics being in place. You can see the slots where many of the mechanical valve systems were getting in. Over on the right side, you start to see the control tower, starting to see it constructed. Then all of a sudden the buildings start going up. Again, all the support buildings. Preparations for the slots for the lock gates that were going in here in the machinery room. Again, the control tower itself. This is on the Atlantic site. And then now they're getting ready, finishing up the excavation and bringing the flood water for the testing. Again, testing the project, running the gates, doing a demo with a ship that will come through here prior to the inauguration. And then came the final day on June 26th. 2016, the inauguration of the Panama Canal. So, fast and furious. A lot going on. No questions here. This is actually my 2 daughters and their 2 friends next door from Paraguay. Very international community we're in, jumping for joy prior to the flooding of the lock. So. I'll open it up now, and I'm happy to share what I can.
Great, thank you so much, Rick. That was a really mega project, right? So, yeah, it's really, really exciting just to have this brief overview of all these huge things that happened. I see that we have a question. Actually, we have a question from Lazarus. Lazarus is getting to the point regarding safety. So he says that there are so many spaces and a lot of vehicles and a lot of machinery around there. So the question is, how do you manage staff safety? And on terms regarding, different cultures value safety differently, right? And you need to follow some rules, especially when it comes for the safety. So how did it work, having all these people together on this site?
Well, great question. First of all, the Panama Canal, the operations, the transit operations value safety before we even started construction. So that was a nice thing from the client. They had that culture already. But not all the Panamanians, as you can imagine, like construction anywhere. So what we did is we actually brought in on our program team, we brought in some safety experts. We helped to establish the tools and processes, put them into construction contracts. Part of the onboarding for any construction worker that came in from the contract was the intensive training about safety. We had full teams on the construction sites managing safety along with the contractors required safety team. So on site, there would be first aid training, like I say, inauguration training for every employee on the PPE that they had to wear. It was mandatory. So was it 100% successful? No, like any mega project, we had our issues. But what we did is we incrementally saw the culture and the people start to embrace it. When they saw everyone doing the same thing, it became normal. And the work approaches. So prior to doing a big type of, let's say, the concrete patching, we required them to come up with all the safety aspects, how they're going to do it, how they're going to put the scaffolding in place, how they're going to have good airflow in there because they're going to be sanding things, different things like that. We checked and monitored them, worked with the contractors. And that's what it really was a bottom up, but you had to have enough of the people and the resources and commitment to monitor them. Because the contractor, like any, they were doing the best they could, but of course they were going to not expend where they didn't have to. So a lot of it was our team working with them. There was weekly safety meetings with our team and the contractors, all the different contractors. Then in the group meeting, it was part of the recognition, and those statistics also elevated all the way up to the program, even to the CEO who was worried and wanted to know what was the safety incidents. So it started early on in the program. It was driven throughout. It wasn't start day one that you had the highest level of understanding. It was actually incremental. So
great. So just before we go, Rick, I think that I need to read that Mr. Kasabi's quote that says that many of us would like and wish to work with this impressive project. So I can relate with that. And yeah, that will be really interesting to be part of this huge project. And I understand it's been 12 years of your life, right? 12 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And granted, I was there for many of the years after the opening. Like any of these jobs, and I didn't touch too much. There's always the after construction. There was a warranty period. There was when we opened, there was a huge punch list, but that's okay because the Canal Authority said we want transits. So even if we had to do some work, some painting of doors or checking of different electrical systems, not all the automation was in place. There still was the driver get the ships through. So we were helping them afterwards. And then also post-construction, there was issues with wrapping up any claims and disputes, etc. So we're there throughout that. So great. I see someone that worked for CH Thumb Hill. Again, a nice comment coming up. CH Thumb Hill itself was started in Corvallis, Oregon, at Oregon State University. Cornell, Howland, Hayes, and Merrifield were Fred Merrifield. The M was a professor prior to World War II, and his three students were Cornell, Howland, and Hayes. In 1946, they started their civil engineering firm, which grew into CH Thumb Hill and eventually into Jacobs.
We have one last question, Mr. Rick. What were the drivers to material reuse? Was it mainly because of logistics, or were there environmental drivers or guidance from the client as well?
I think there was a little of both. From an environmental standpoint, we looked to optimize certain materials were going to have to come from long distance. But for example, all of the concrete aggregate, there was choices on how they would use it. They used the basalt excavated materials. They brought in an aggregate crushing plant. At that time, it was the largest temporary aggregate crushing plant. It won't compete, of course, with the mining industry in the world, so that we were able to crush the aggregate not only for the Pacific site, but also for the Atlantic site. So they would transit the material that was 2 stages of crushing from Pacific, barge it to the Atlantic site. So that was really a really green way of thinking about having their materials. There was a lot of, again, care on environmental, because of the drilling and blasting, thinking about clearing out the animal rescue, looking at the communities. Some of the water, the lake water was raised, as I mentioned. There was some small communities. They had to move some of the people. They did that and did that very successfully. So I think there's a mixed bag on it. It was, but the Canal Authority was looking holistically. I think that was part of it. They wanted to make sure they are positive partners with society there, and that's really important to them.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Rick, for your time today and for this insightful presentation. And we are looking forward for the same presentation in the future with your Hellinicon experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Wouldn't that be wonderful? I'm sure we have a great team working with the client again, going through the same lessons. There's a lot of startup challenges on anything, but I see really positive momentum, and it's going to be a great thing for the country of Greece, and happy to be part of it, and know you guys will have long successes and stories to share in the future. So
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
everybody.
Mr. Rick.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great night. Bye. Have a great evening.
Bye.
thank you all. Appreciate it. Take care.